Hi everyone, it's Connor DC from the Cloud 365 team, and today we're going to be showing you how to create a time recording application using Power Apps in SharePoint. The whole purpose of this application is to allow our users to be able to click a start and a stop button against a project that they're working on to record a given time. This is a highly sought after solution, and I'm really excited to show you how to get started with this. So let's jump over to my desktop and I'll show you how we can get this started. So I'm over at my desktop and I've jumped straight into the Cloud 365 sandpit. And as usual, this is where I'm going to be building the solution. So we're going to start off with the SharePoint data source, as we always do. It's just an easy way to get a grasp as to where we're going to be building things, the type of infrastructure that's going to be put in place to allow us to fill out the information in Power Apps more appropriately. So inside of SharePoint, I'm going to go ahead and create a new list. So it doesn't matter where you create this, it's entirely up to you. But for the purpose of this, I'm going to create this in the Cloud 365 sandpit. And I'm going to select new and select list. So I'm going to select blank list and I'm going to name this project time records. And I'm going to press create. As always, we get our title, which is our default column, which we cannot remove. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a bunch of other columns. So let's think about what we need in this solution. I need to be able to record a start time and an end time. I also need to be able to record the actual time spent, so the difference between those two times. I also need to maybe select a project, so the project that the user is allocating his or hers time to. And finally, I'm going to use a yes or no field for what we're going to be calling the active session, so whether the session is active or not. And this is going to allow us to perform some sort of conditional formatting around our buttons and timers, which we'll get into later on in the video. So let's go ahead and start this. So we'll start with our button here called add column, and we're going to create a start time using the date and time. I'm going to name this start time. And I'm also going to include the time here as well and press save. I'm going to do the same, add another date and time, and I'm going to call this end time. And I'm going to include the time there as well. I'm going to add a number, and this is going to be the time spent. So this is going to be the conversion into minutes or hours, however we choose to display it. And I'm also going to add a choice column, and this is going to be for a choice of projects. Now I'm going to predefine these projects in the choices here. You can use lookup columns where you can point to another SharePoint list where you might then want to have more information about the project you're working on. That's a little bit more advanced, but for the purpose of this, we're just going to keep things basic and we're going to use a choice field for this. So the choices I'm going to use, I'm just going to pick 3 random projects. I'm going to say that we're working on a new website. I'm going to say that we're going to be doing some advertising and marketing. And for choice 3, we'll go with create new YouTube videos. So there are 3 projects that, for instance, a small company might be working on. And I'm just going to give this the name of project. And we'll press save. And finally, we'll just add that yes or no column, which was going to be whether the session is active. So we'll call this active session. And we'll set the default value to no and press save. Now what I'm going to do here, just so we can look at things for reference, is I'm also going to add a column and click show/hide columns. And let's show our ID for each of our records. And I'm just going to drag this to the front. And this is just so that when we are starting our timer and stopping our timer, we can visually see which ID or which record that we are marking our start and end time against. So what we'll do is we're also going to use the title to hold the user's email address. So that way we can see exactly which user with a unique value because everyone has their own unique emails. So we're going to be able to see which user is submitting that time. So that's all we need for SharePoint for the moment. We're going to leave this tab open, but we're going to jump into Power Apps. And I'm going to show you how we can start creating the beautiful Power App that's going to allow our users to start a timer, end a timer, choose a project, visually see how long the timer's been running for, and have that all be sent over to our SharePoint data source. So over here in Power Apps, let's go to Create, and we're going to create an app from blank. And we're going to select the format as phone, and we're going to call this the timesheet, and press Create. So if you're familiar with Power Apps, you'll know that you have your first screen that's available to you and nothing else. We're going to start building upon this. The first thing we need to do is we need to add our data source so we can use the information in our SharePoint list in Power Apps. And we can do that by coming over to the data source button on the left and pressing Add Data. Let's do a search for SharePoint. And it's going to ask us to connect up a SharePoint site. So we know that we're using the Cloud 365 Sandpit, or whatever you guys have chosen. And we're going to use the project time records list that we created just a minute ago. And press Connect. So now that information is available to use in Power Apps. So we can retrieve all of the columns, the records, each individual piece of information, and output it in any visual way in Power Apps. So let's think about what our users need to be able to do. They need to be able to press a start button to start a timer. They need to press a stop button to stop the timer. They need to be able to select the project from a drop-down list. And they possibly might also want to see the status of the timer or how long they've actually been in that session for live as they are working. So starting from the top, let's add our two buttons. If we go to the Add button on the left, we can select the button item on the left. I'm going to make these nice and big because our app is primarily focused on having these nice two big buttons on our screen. So I'm also going to duplicate this and drag this underneath, make sure it's nicely aligned. We also needed to include our drop-down list, which is going to allow users to select a project. We can do this by including a form on Power Apps and pointing it to our SharePoint list. And from there, we can go ahead and remove all of the irrelevant information that we don't need to display. So if we go to the Insert tab at the top, and we can press Forms and select Edit. We can select our data source as the SharePoint list we just included. And if we go to our tree view and expand our form, we can just remove some information that we don't want. So we can remove the title card, we can remove the start time card, the end time card, the time spent card, the active session card, and the attachments card. So now we just have just the project. So I'm just going to position our form so it fits the screen a little nicer. And for aesthetics, we can give our app a title. So we'll call this the timesheet tracking as our title. We'll place that in the center as well. And we'll make this nice and bold. So we now have our project with our drop down. I'm going to rename the button here to Start. And I'm going to rename the second button to End. And I'm also going to include a timer at the bottom. Now the way we're going to do this is by using a timer and passing the value from that timer into a text label. And that way we can manipulate the text label however we want, and you get a little bit more control over the styling of your timer. So for now, we're not going to include the timer, we'll just include the label, which will eventually populate that information. So I'll put this in here, and I'm just going to center align this. I'm going to duplicate this just to give some user feedback above it. So we'll just put in here current time. So that's going to kind of be the outline of how our application is going to look. So what we can do, we can also change the colors of our buttons. So we can make our start button a nice green, and our end button a nice red. Okay, so let's start by building out the functionality of our buttons. Now, the way our buttons are going to work is they're going to update our SharePoint list, whether that's going to be creating a new record in that SharePoint list or editing a record that already exists. So let's start with the start button. For the start button, we're going to be using a function called patch. Patch is going to be the function that allows us to edit or create an entry into a database. So to do this, if we select on our start button, and we make sure the onSelect property is selected, we can see it's currently set to false, which basically means that this property is not going to do anything. The first thing we want to do is we want to begin by declaring what type of function it is. So we're going to use the phrase patch. Now, as you start typing in a function, you'll see that it will try to auto-finish any functions that you're typing. And you can do so by selecting it with the arrow keys and pressing tab. And you can see that the next part of the information it's asking for is the source, and that's going to be the data source. Now, we know that we're going to be using our SharePoint list, which is already here for us as project time records. So we'll select that and press tab. Now, if you look at the Power Apps documentation for the patch function, you'll know that we can use what's called defaults to create a new entry in the list, which is what we want to do every time we press the start button. So we're going to start with a comma, and we'll use defaults. And now we need to choose which data source we would like to add our entry to. So again, we can just choose project time records. We can close that off with a close brackets, and we can press comma. So the next bit of information is the actual update that we want to apply to this patch. And we declare this by declaring which columns we would like to fill with the relevant information. So to do this, we're going to open with a curly brackets, and you'll see that we are given a list of all of the columns that are available in our SharePoint list, such as the active session that we chose. We have the attachments, which was already created by default. We can see things like the end time. If we scroll down even further, we can see that we have the project and the start time, the time spent, etc., etc. So this is how we're going to populate that information. So the first thing I'm going to populate is going to be the title. And we're going to fill the title with the user's email. And that's how we're going to see visually in SharePoint who has filled out or who is recording time for a specific project. So we can use the inbuilt Power Apps function called user, and then we can use .email. So that's user open close brackets .email, and that's going to return the current logged in user's email address, and that's going to populate that inside that title field. So what other information do we want to include here? So if we press our comma, we can add a second field. And for this one, we're going to use our project. Now, where are we going to get this project information from? The project information is going to come from that drop-down list that we've just created. So we need to find out the value of the drop-down box. We can do this by selecting on the data card from our form, and then selecting inside on our drop-down list. And we can see that this is the data card value 3. So if we go back to our start button, at the end of project, we can start typing data card value 3. And then if we press dot, we can then use selected. So this is going to be the selected value from that drop-down list. We can press our comma, and we can also include our start time. So if we type in start time and press tab, that's filled out our start time, and we need to populate this with the current date and time when they press the button. And Power Apps has a built-in function called now, which we can use for this. So if we start typing now, and we just do an open close bracket for that, and we'll place a comma there, And the last piece of information that we want to populate is going to be whether the session is active. Now we know that they've just pressed the start button, which is triggering this function. So we're going to set this to true. So if we type in active session, and we can place the value as true. Now a yes or no field in SharePoint comes back as a true or false value in Power Apps. That's just something to bear in mind. So what we can do is we can close this with a close squiggly brackets, and we can then close this with a close curly brackets as well. And that is our function in place for our patch. So when we press the start button now, we should see some information go into our SharePoint list. And we can test this by pressing the little play icon in the top right. But as we can see, we've got no item to display under our project. So if I just close this, and I'll show you how to fix this. If we select on our form, we need to just set the default mode to new. So let's go and test this in the right way. Let's go and press our play icon. We'll select our project, we'll select new website, and we'll press start. Now it doesn't look like much has happened, but that little bit of functionality should have triggered off, and we should see some information in our SharePoint list. So if we head over to SharePoint, we can see that we have our new ID 1, which is our first entry. We have our email address. We have our start date and time. We also have our project, and our active session is set to true. Now at the moment we don't have any end time and we don't have any time spent because that hasn't been calculated yet, and that will be calculated when we end our session. Let's head back over to Power Apps, and we'll take a look at some functionality that we need to include for our end button. So let's select our end button and make sure our onSelect property is set. And we can do something very similar to what we've just written out. So we'll start with patch. We'll select our SharePoint list that we would like to update. So we've got to bear in mind that we are updating an item in this list. We're not creating a new one now because we want to set the end time for the record that we've just added. Now, as you remember before with the start button, we used defaults to create a new entry into our SharePoint list. Now, the way the patch works once you want to update an item that already exists is you have to do a validation check against the record that you would like to update. Now, at present, there's no real way of doing that. And this is why we brought in the ID column in our SharePoint list, so we can just see exactly what's going on. But before we can use that ID in a usable way in Power Apps, we first have to set a variable in Power Apps, which is going to allow us to retrieve that value. And we can actually do this straight from our start button. And all we have to do is we just wrap our patch with a variable, or setting a variable. So if we type in set at the beginning, and we'll give our variable a name, we'll call this var new item, followed by a comma. And then that places that whole patch as it's a variable in itself, which we can then call from anywhere within Power Apps. And what I'll do as well is I'll just add a close bracket just to finish off that syntax as well. So if we head back to our end button, that variable now when we press the start button is going to be available to us in Power Apps. Now to use this, we can add a comma after our source, and where our record is, we can use what's called a lookup expression to compare our ID against the ID that was last set by Power Apps from when we pressed that start button. So we can do this by typing in lookup with an open bracket. We can select our SharePoint list. And what we want to do is we want to grab that variable, that var new item. If we press full stop, we can get all of the columns that are going to be available to us from that. And we want to grab the ID from that patch that we just created. And we want to check that it is equal to the ID of our SharePoint list. I'm going to close that off with a close bracket and add a comma. We'll do our update patch with our curly brackets. So in here, what do we need to change? So first of all, we need to add an end time. And again, this is going to be a value now. So the current time when they press the button, And we also want to update the time spent. And we're going to use what's called a dateDiff function to calculate this. So if we type in time spent, we can retrieve that column from SharePoint. And we can use a dateDiff function here. And the way we're going to calculate this is by using the start date, the end date, and the format in which we want to display this. So we're going to use our var new item, and then we're going to do dot start time, followed by a comma, followed by now, because that's going to be when we press the button. And then we're going to display this in minutes. And we can do a close bracket as well. And if we just add a bracket on the end of this function as well, just to complete our syntax. So what we're updating here is now the end time with the current time that it is now. We're then calculating that start time from the patch that we used when we pressed the start button. And we're displaying that in minutes. So if we just add a comma here as well, and we can include our active session, and we'll change this to false. And that should complete our end function for populating that information. So just to be safe, I'm also going to do the same thing that I did before, and I'm going to set that var new item as our patch at the end there as well. So that will constantly update that patch with that information. So if we end up accidentally being able to press the start button again, that shouldn't update that information when we don't need it to. So we can go ahead and we can test this now. So if we go ahead and press the start button, and we can use advertising and marketing for this one. So we can see that we have one entry in here. I'm just going to remove this entry. And I'm going to go ahead and press the start button. And we'll see that we have our new entry in SharePoint, as we did before. Now what we're expecting to see when we press our end button is the new end date and time being placed in here with our calculated time spent in minutes. So after a minute, if I go ahead and I press that end button, we should see that that time spent should return about 1, maybe 2 minutes inside there, along with our end time. So if I return to SharePoint now, and I do a quick refresh, we can see that we spent 2 minutes working on our advertising and marketing project, and we see our end time that is in there as well. We can also see that our active session has been returned to false. Now we could stop there, as that's kind of the functionality in place that proves that this system works. Now what we can also do is we can give a bit of user feedback to the users in Power Apps that are using the Power App. And we can do this by disabling buttons as and when they're pressed, because we wouldn't want a user being able to press the start button multiple times, creating multiple entries, and then the system would end up just getting confused as to where to place the end time. So we can do this by disabling the button once the button is pressed. So let's return to Power Apps. So from here, we can use what's called the display mode on our start and end buttons in Power Apps. So if we select the property with our start button selected, and we navigate up to display mode, we can see that it's currently in display mode edit. Now we can change this to disabled, and you can see that that doesn't allow us to press our button like we can on the end button. So what we can do here is we can set the status of this display mode based on the active session variable in SharePoint, whether that's set to true or false. So we can use if statements. So inside the display mode of our start button, we can begin by typing if. And then we can say that if the var new item, which is that patch information, dot active session equals true, followed by a comma, then we can set what will happen in the true value if this is true. So we can set the display mode to disabled, followed by a comma, followed by edit, which basically means that if the active session is set to true, then we'll set the display mode to disabled, else we'll set it to edit, and that's going to allow us to press that start button again. And we're going to close this off with a close brackets. If we select our end button and we go ahead and select our display mode, we can do something similar here where we type our if statement, whether the var new item dot active session, and then we can say if it's false, then we want it to be display mode dot disabled, comma display mode edit. So now if we go ahead and test this, if we press our start button, we can no longer press our start button, we can only end our timer. Once we press our end timer, our start button becomes available again. And it's getting that information directly from SharePoint. So what other functionality can we provide? We can also provide an on-screen timer, which resets along with these buttons. And that's going to give a bit more user feedback as to how much time they're spending on their projects. And that's why we've included these two text fields at the bottom for the current time, and then we're going to have our value in there as well. So before we can go ahead and use these, we first need to include a timer. So we can do this by going to our input tab at the top, scrolling down and selecting timer. Now I'm just going to place our timer in the bottom right hand side for now. And this timer is going to become invisible, but still working in the background. But just so we can set this up and see what's happening, I'll keep it here for the purpose of this. So with our timer, we have some functions which we can use, or some properties that we can set. So if we scroll down with our timer selected, you can see that we have a start and we have a reset property, which both of those we are going to be using to set this information. So if we select our start property, we can see that this is set to false. Now what we want to do is we want to create a variable that we can change from anywhere else to set this to true or false. And the way we're going to do this is by setting a variable when the application starts. So if we go to our app and the left hand side on our tree view, we can then select our onStart property and we can create some variables. So the first variable I'm going to do is I'm going to set a new variable and I'm going to call this var timer active. And this is going to say whether the timer is active or not. And by default, this is going to be set to false. The second variable I'm going to set is going to be one I'm going to call var timer reset. And this is going to again be set to false. And this is going to allow us to determine whether our timer has been reset to 0 or not. And you can see that we've got a little red squiggly line issue there, and that's just because we haven't put a semicolon on the end when we are creating a new line. So what we can do here is we can set the timer by selecting on our timer, go into the start property, and we can set the false value to our variable, which is still set to false, and that's going to be the var timer active. Now at the moment that's still not going to do anything. The timer is still going to be set to false, as is that variable. So we need to then update the context of that variable to true when we press the start button. To be able to use the variables we've just set, we need to initialize them. And to do that, because the variables are going to be set when the app starts, Power Apps has included a function on the app ellipsis here called run on start. And that's just going to initialize the variables so we can actually use them. So let's head over to our start button and we're going to do a semicolon. And we're going to add a bit of functionality here called update context, followed by a squiggly open close bracket, followed by a normal close bracket. Now in here, I'm going to update the context of our var timer active. And I'm going to say that we're going to set this to true. And if I do the same thing for our end button and set this to false, so we'll add our semicolon. We'll do an update context. And inside here, we'll do our var timer active. And we'll set this to false. Now, what we should see is if we go and test our application, we should press our start button, we should see our timer start increasing, which is perfect and exactly how we want it. It's always great when things go to plan. Now, what you'll notice is when I press the end button, the timer will pause because we've just changed the value to false. However, when we start a new session, it's going to continue up from 11 seconds or wherever we stopped the timer initially. Now, this is where we're going to include that reset variable. So going back to our start button, we'll add a semicolon, we'll do a update context. And we're going to change the value of our timer reset. And we're going to set this to false. And we'll do the same here for our end button. And set the value to true. So our timer's still not going to work as planned because we haven't given the reset value of our timer the variable that we've just set. So if we select our timer, just like the start property that we set as var timer active, we're going to set the reset property now to var timer reset. And if we go ahead and test this by pressing start, we can see that our timer goes up as planned. We can end this, and it's going to reset our timer back to 0. Now, to display this in a nicer way, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to hide the timer by selecting it and selecting the visible property to off. Then we're going to select this text label that we created at the beginning of this session, and we're going to give it the value of our timer. So we know our timer is called timer1, as specified on the tree view on the left here. And then we're going to do a full stop followed by text. And just to give this a little bit more styling, I'm going to make this bold. I'm also going to bring up the size. And I'm going to bring down the size of this as well. And that kind of concludes how our mobile application is going to work. Now, if I return to SharePoint, as I've been testing this out a lot, pressing the stop button loads of times, we can see plenty of values in here that have all gone to plan as we expected it to. Now, we can do much more with this. We can send this information to Power BI and produce some really awesome Power BI reports and charts to show how long each user has been working on different bits of information and projects for. And we can get better visual summaries of that, which maybe we'll get to in another video. But that kind of gives you a really cool outline of building a fully fledged mobile application that's going to allow your users to track time that they're spending on their projects. So I hope you enjoyed that video. Hopefully you've taken that solution miles further by creating Power BI reports and maybe including payroll information and hourly rates to see how much your projects are costing you per user. You can take this solution miles into the distance, but I'll leave that up to your imagination. I hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you again in the next one.